Battles of the American Revolution, Tri-Pack, Guildford, Saratoga and Brandywine, all in one re-released box set, 4 battles across these 3 games, all of which were designed by Mark S. Miklos and published by GMT Games. Today I'm going to be doing the first video in a series of playthrough videos for Saratoga, which was the first one released in the series way back about 20 years ago. The game is for 2 players. However, the solitaire is rated as reasonably good. Personally, I think it perhaps should be slightly lower than what's on the box, but I'll get to that as we go through. The game itself is obviously part of a series, so I'll be using both the series rules, however modified by the specific rules for Saratoga itself. It's obviously going to have some variation depending on which game you're playing, because there's a fair few differences in Saratoga versus the main rules in terms of certain movement and so on, and locations and things you can do. The other games in the series, so I think some of the more recent ones come with a like a solo assistant, if you like, that way you roll dice to try to assess what the opponent might play in terms of cards, which are sat here. And I will be using that as we go through predominantly. The first few combats that I'll play it as though I'm playing both sides together, and I'm making decisions for both sides. So this actually came with the CSI magazine insert rather than one of those other games. Okay, so let's go. So I'm going to assume there's no particular familiarity with the series. I'm reasonably new to it myself, so as we go through, flag in the comments and so on if you see any glaring errors or I do anything completely stupid as I'm playing. So the overall system revolves around a few different mechanisms which add a bit of chrome to the standard hex encounter move combat kind of sequence. There is a morale track which helps determine initiative and combat modifiers, among other things. The turn order in this game, which is right at the very top there, and if I slide the board down you might be able to see what I'm talking about. The turn order and so on is set for the first 3 turns. After that it is a randomly generated turn order in terms of who has the initiative and therefore goes first. The first 2 turns the British player only will play, and there's only British reinforcements in the entire game. There's no American reinforcements as we play through. The other element of extra bits and bobs are these tactics cards and the momentum chits that go with them. So these represent orders that you can give your side when you come into close combat, and the other player will play a card and you'll play a card, and whatever the compared result is a modifier on the final dice roll. Okay, and finally we have these momentum chits which allow you to make a die roll modifier in combat, initiative and so on. So there's a few extra bits and bobs, but generally speaking it is a fairly typical hex encounter game in its move, shoot, retreat kind of sequence. On the board specific to this game I've put some cubes. Now these are my own addition just to show where I'm talking about as I talk for this next segment, and I'll remove them shortly. Basically these cubes represent objectives for both sides, the orange being the British side, the yellow being the Americans. This area here is Freeman's Farm. Now I don't know a huge amount about the American Revolution, but I understand that the battle around here was quite significant, and there's been many games focusing just on this particular part of this battle. But here we're doing the whole battle, including the Bemis Heights and the forts and so on around here. However, this area, for this game, the yellow cubes represent where the Americans need to get adjacent units in order to score a VP. The central hex, which is orange, is the hex that the British need to control with a non-artillery combat unit in order to score that same VP. This hex here with the 2 yellow cubes is an automatic win for the Americans if they control that hex. And we have 2 similar locations over here on the Bemis Heights, where if the British manage to control, they will also have a victory automatically if they control either of those two spaces. So there's a few different victory conditions, and at the end, if you don't have achieved any of these, you work out VPs based on combat losses. For this game specifically, there's a few movement restrictions for the Americans in particular. Basically, there's a little dotted line that runs along here where the darker blue units, which is Gates's wing, as they're called, they cannot move unless the British side are within a certain number of hexes of basically here or here. When they're within a certain number of hexes, then they can move normally. However, underneath some of these hexes are like little triangles. You may or may not be able to see that on the screen. They are garrisons, and they have to have at least one non-artillery combat unit in them at all times, unless the British force a retreat from those hexes, and by doing so, they can then move. The Americans can then move normally. Should the American player choose to abandon those garrisons, it's a VP to the British. What else have we got? Artillery for the Americans. You would normally be able to move a certain number of hexes as artillery, just like with any other unit. However, here they have a parenthesis around the number 3 once it focuses, and that shows that the American artillery cannot move from its starting location until it is forced to by the British. So there's a lot of quite static positions for the American player at the beginning. And essentially the flow of the game at the start, at least, is the British will come charging up through the forest, along the river road, which is the bit where the Hudson River is at the top there, and then we'll get into combat around here. Now, this lighter blue is Arnold's wing, I believe, top of my head, and these can move without the restriction of those yellow dotted lines. However, they still have to have a certain number of non-combat units in those garrison places. So there's limited flexibility in movement for the lighter blue units. I've put down here various different unit types that are in the game, and I'm going to just zoom in a little bit now just to go through that before we start playing properly. These units here are a rough cross-section of what's available in the game, and by extension I understand is roughly what's available in the whole series as well, but for now we'll just concentrate on what's in this game and the applicable special rules for some of these units. First up, we have leaders. So these are the counters with a picture on and a name. This is Burgoyne there. We have Fraser for the British, and here is Gates for the Americans. Okay, there are a number of features about these counters. So we have the starting hex location, which is 1831. We have 3 numbers, which is the combat modifier, the leadership modifier, and movement. And then there's a star ranking. Now, leadership modifier, if you need to rally or anything like that, you would add that to the die roll. Combat modifier added to the die roll for combat. The star is rank, essentially. So Burgoyne there is basically a 3-star leader. This guy here, Fraser, is a 1-star leader. If they're stacked together, priority goes to Burgoyne. The Americans too have a similar system, basically the same with the exception of the different leaders on the front. The Americans do have this person here called Morgan. He's not a leader in the strictest sense of the word, but he has got a star, which means he is a demi-leader and therefore can confer certain leadership benefits to the units he's stacked with if he chooses to combat. He's also a rifleman and a light infantry, which I will come to shortly when I look at the other units. However, just to show that there is a not quite leader for the American side, and it's actually quite an important counter as we go through the game. You'll see that one used quite a lot. Okay, aside from the leaders, we have regular units. Now these guys have less stats, but quite important stats. So we have the combat strength, which is the 3 for the American. Then we have movement points, which is the 4. Usual sort of thing for in terms of the stats there. There is a small +1 on both of them, and that is their morale modifier, which modifies the roll for morale check, combat modifiers, that kind of thing. So these are the regular the regular units. Some of them are double-sided, some of them are only single-sided. And as in most games, you change that as you make step losses and so on for combat and other things. We then have the units with the LT on it, that is light infantry. They are basically the same as others, with the exception that they have movement benefits in wooded terrain, particularly important in this game, and also for modifiers if they're being shot at by artillery or riflemen. We have here this unit, which is the German Jaegers. So in this game we have the British are red, British allies from Germany are green, and then we have other colours like brown and sort of a pale yellow that represent Allied forces and militia for the British side. Basically, if the colour is not a shade of blue, they're British or fighting for the British side. But anyway, back to the Jaeger units here. These are riflemen. They have the same stats as before, combat and movement and morale, but the rifle allows them to fire in a special phase called the rifle fire phase. And what that will do is it will allow you to essentially have a ranged combat phase in addition to any artillery that's fired. And these are quite important. You have extra movement costs to move adjacent to them, and you also have the opportunity, obviously, to shoot. Now, Jaegers, with certain circumstances, can have an additional die roll when they fire. We'll get to that if and when that crops up. But all rifle units, and there's only a couple in the whole game, but all rifle units have what's called a first fire DRM, which is a modifier to the die roll the first time they see combat. Next up, we have associated units. So we have militia and the like, and these are basically here to show that we have different types of units that receive a negative die roll in combat for certain circumstances if they're militia versus fully trained soldiers, and also some units, for example cavalry, or here the Ottawa unit, they can withdraw before combat, and again if that happens we'll come up to it. Finally, we have the artillery, and again the artillery, I touched on the American artillery before in terms of their movement differences, but the main thing to think about with artillery is that they are quite slow. They are quite static in many ways, particularly for the Americans, and they also do not get involved in close combat. They only really fire during what's called the defensive fire phase, and so they are a defensive weapon rather than an offensive one, which, having just played a whole bunch of World War II games, artillery is not normally thought of in that way, by me at least. Okay, so that's a whiz through the counters, a whiz through the overall nature of the game. I think the only thing to mention before I do start playing is zone of control. Now this is really interesting because all units have a zone of control unless they're disrupted, all that usual sort of thing. But here, zone of control does not extend into the forest. It extends out of the forest, but not into. And so on this map, which is probably 75–80% forest, whole swathes of this map does not have zone of control applicable to it, which is an interesting thing when you start playing, particularly around the Freeman Farm area. Okay, I'm going to finish setup and then we will go from there. Okay, turn one, British only turn, possibility of fog. Fog is a special rule for Saratoga, at least as far as I've got through the series. It's a special rule applicable to Saratoga, and we need to roll a die. And on a roll of 0, we have dense fog. Okay, we've rolled a 0. That means that's dense fog and the entire game turn is skipped. Now I had to think about this for a second because this is an interesting one, because generally speaking, with stacking, you're only allowed 6 points of stacking, plus 1 artillery, plus 1 leader. Now, when you look at the gargantuan stacks of British over on the left-hand side there, they're obviously massively overstacked. And what happens in the first couple of turns normally is you move down along the road. But here, we skip the whole game turn. Now, what would normally happen is you would use step losses until you're down to that stacking point. But any reinforcements that were normally due would simply enter on the next turn. So in the absence of an FAQ to hand immediately, or any immediate clarification as far as I can see in the rule, I'm just going to assume these are reinforcements now coming in on turn 2. So that's an interesting one straight away. Okay, but turn 2, we now need to roll the die again. And let's see if we have any further fog. And we also have the introduction of more reinforcements, essentially, which could be problematic for the British. All right, we've rolled a 6. That is clear. Okay, so normal movement, no problem at all in terms of any restrictions due to the fog. The 3 choices normally are dense fog, moderate fog and clear. Moderate fog means you can't use what's known as strategic movement. We'll get to that as we move these units normally. But first thing we need to do is place the reinforcements onto the board, and here we have the first of the German reinforcements. Reinforcements come on in all cases for the British either here at entry point B in the top corner here, which I hope you can see, or later in the game some Royal Marine Navy type units come on here, but there are certain movement restrictions for those Navy units which I will talk about as they arrive. But the first thing to do is to try and get these units spread out along the road in a way that's not going to limit stacking or cause step losses due to stacking limits. So let's see how we go with that. Now, because of that stacking limit, and that stacking limit is applicable at all times in the entire turn, you have to move 1 unit at a time to ensure the stacking's not broken. And obviously if you do break the stacking, you need to take those step losses. This is already a tricky position for a British player to be in because there's just so many units. The other option I could take, of course, is I could delay those German units until turn number 3 and bring those on in turn 3. In fact, I think I will do that. I will wait and move them back to the turn track, putting them with the other German reinforcements that come on next turn. Okay, so that's going to reduce the amount of logistical aggravation for the British player by doing that. But of course, with the delay, it does mean it's going to be that much longer before we get into combat with the Americans, giving the Americans more time to do things when their turn comes. So let's look at the stacking here. So we have got a mix of British, German and other units here, and we will move according to the strategic movement, which is double the regular movement. So I'm going to move the leader first. He's only going to move 8 because his regular movement is 6, which would allow him to move 12, but the units he would stack with can only move 4. So I will move him 8 down the road with strategic movement. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. Show that little crossroads there. We have some light infantry next, which are these ones here. They have varying points of strength, therefore we do need to move those one at a time and try and spread them out on the road a wee bit. So we can go 8 would bring it here with Fraser. This unit here is no longer light infantry, that has a 5, so the most we can do with that unit is pop it into that stack, and then no more can go into that stack because we would be overstacked basically. Okay, the next couple of units are an artillery unit and 24th Regiment, I think, 24th Brigade. And so we move those, but we're going to have to move that behind. That's okay for the soldiers there, the redcoats. However, the artillery can only move 6 because they have a baseline movement of 3, which is going to bring them 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, going to bring them there. And the artillery are quite a bit slower, and you'll start to see them slow down and drag out behind the foot soldiers in a moment. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're okay because that's an artillery unit and they can stack for free. However, we cannot go any further than that because the combat strength here of this unit is 4. This unit has a combat strength of 5, meaning we do have to stop just there, or we'd break that 6-point limit. The Jaegers are next. They only have a combat strength of 1, so they can come with the Grenadiers, but I think I'll keep them with their compatriots because their compatriots combined only have a strength of 5 in total. So we can place all of those into that one space behind the grenadiers, and the artillery can move 6, which will get it nicely to the same space. So they're staying quite organised there, those German support troops for the British side. And finally we have a few militia and the like, some light infantry and some regular infantry or regular militia type units. So we'll move the light infantry together, and the light infantry can move through wooded terrain at a cost of 1 per hex, whereas for regular infantry it's a cost of 1.5. So these can go from that starting hex, go 1, 2, 3, 4. They can both live their total strength value of 2. The others though, if they want to go through cross country, they'll only be able to go to here, or we could just slide them all up the road behind the Germans, because they have 1 strength point each. So hopefully you can see how this flows and how we're going to spread out down the road for the British side. We now need to do the same with Burgoyne's units, which are just here, and they are going to come down this river road, which is a bigger road compared to these tracks here. Now, just a quick clarification on my thinking here versus what's explicitly printed in the rules. Now, the strategic movement is allowed along roads. Here, a road, which would be this, and a track, which is these other areas, are different terrain types in the terrain key. However, on this terrain effects chart, the road stroke track are the same, and down here it says roads negate other terrain. Now my thinking is, because they're listed as road and track, I'm assuming the tracks allow that strategic movement. Not 100% sure, if I'm honest, and of course please do let me know if I'm getting that wrong, but that's how I'm playing it, because to be honest, if we didn't, there'd be an awful lot of stacking problems along here, plus it would take forever for the British to get anywhere near Freeman's Farm, especially with that dense fog, as we spoke about before. But okay, let's carry on with this turn 2, and then we'll move into turn 3, which will be the start of the Americans' turn. So I'm just going to move these guys along, and I'm going to move their full 8, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Strategic movement has to go along the road from one point to the other, and you cannot go adjacent to any enemy enemies or anything like that. Artillery can only go 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're going to stop there because of combat restriction, point restriction. And then there, and then the leader will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Leader can go right on the front of the group. Okay, cool. That is turn 2 done. No more fog to worry about. Therefore, we can jump straight into turn 3 and the start of the American turn. Turn 3 then, the first time the Americans will get to activate in this particular game. I've zoomed in a little bit just so you can see a little bit more clearly what's going on, hopefully. Now the turn structure for this turn is again different from most turns, or from all the other turns that will follow. And essentially, if I just chuck the sequence of play on the screen here, you can see that we would normally have initiative followed by initiative player's turn. You'd move through movement, rally, artillery fire, rifle fire, combat, second player turn, and then admin and so on before moving into the next turn. That's different for this turn only, in the sense that there's no initiative segment and the initiative is automatically given to the American side. Now what that means is the British reinforcements, so that stack of German units that I moved to the next turn, they won't come on until the British player's turn, which is after the Americans, so we don't see those on the board just yet. And the Americans are somewhat limited in what they can do, as I mentioned at the beginning. So we're still going to have quite a limited turn. It's unlikely to have any rifle fire or any artillery fire, probably until turn 4. But let's just get some of this initial jostling for position done for the Americans as well. Okay, Arnold's wing has more movement than Gates's Wing. So Gates's Wing are the darker blue coloured American units. So that's basically these ones here, plus Gates himself and some cavalry just over there. All the light blue ones belong to Arnold's Wing, or what I'm referring to as Arnold's Wing. I don't really think it's called that explicitly in the rules, but I'm just using that to differentiate rather than saying dark blue, light blue all the time. Okay, so Arnold's Wing can move within the restriction of the garrisons and the artillery placement. Okay, so there's not actually much we can do with the Americans other than move. Morgan, with his rifle fire benefit and his demi-leader benefit, is sat here with Dearborn. Now Dearborn is this unit. This is just a regular sort of light infantry unit, but when the two are stacked together, so Morgan and Dearborn, there are certain benefits that Morgan gets which negates any modifiers in combat that would normally be negative for a rifle unit. It'll make more sense when we do get into combat in a few turns time, but for now we need to think about how we can control Freeman's Farm. Currently Dearborn and Morgan are both on top of a hill. That's what those kind of little dashes are there. And there's a creek running along and this open space around Freeman's Farm. Everything else is forest. And as I said at the beginning, forests do not allow zone of control. So in order to benefit from a rifle unit's zone of control modifiers, basically a penalty if the other side advance into your zone of control when you're a rifle unit, we need to get them into the clear. So we're going to try to get Morgan and Dearborn into the Freeman Farm area and bring down some, but not all, of Arnold's Wing from here along this sort of track stroke road, again with the hope of getting to Freeman's Farm. Now when we progress through the game, it's important to note that this hex, which is basically a house on a hill, is important for when Gates's Wing, the dark blue ones, are released from their movement restriction later in the game. Basically, if the British side does not get within its 4 hexes of that yellow dotted line, you roll a die and eventually Gates's Wing will be released from that movement restriction. But we'll get to that in a minute. If the British do not control this, there is a die modifier to the roll to release Gates's Wing. Hope that makes sense. It's all part of the specific rules for this game. Right, but anyway, let's concentrate about American movement. Going up and down slopes is a movement modifier, so it would actually cost us 2 to get off the slope, and then we can move 3 and 4 along here. Alternatively, we could move through the forest, which would be quite a bit quicker, but we would have movement penalties, so we'd have 2 and then 4 because of the river or the creek. Let's do that. Let's move them, benefit their light infantry status, and go 2 off the slope into the forest. So that's 1 plus the 1 for the slope, and then across the river, which is 1 for the forest, 1 for the creek, because they're light infantry. They have a little bit of extra movement. That's where we'll stop, but we do now have zones of control into these 2 spaces. And then the next turn, hopefully we'll get these guys more into the centre of Freeman's Farm, where they can control the open spaces a little bit more with their rifle fire. Okie dokie. Next up we have a similar situation for this hex here, which is the Massachusetts, or the 9th Massachusetts unit. So they're not light infantry, so they've got much more restrictive movement in the forest. So basically it's going to cost 2.5 to get down there. There's like a creek and another slope, so it's going to cost an absolute fortune to get across the river. The other option would be to come here and then down the road. Or alternatively, we could just leave them there to try to prevent any obvious attempt to go through the river or through the forest and over the river by the other side. Now, because of the delay in the movement of the British, because of the fog, I'm kind of tempted to move those guys forward to try and meet the British a little bit further towards what is actually the north, this side, compared to what might normally happen if there hadn't been that fog. So that would mean attempting to get some units along here as well. So what we'll do then is we'll move the Massachusetts unit, cost us 2.5 to get down there, and then it would actually be another 2.5 to get there because of the creek and the forest. They're not light infantry, so it does cost 1.5 movement points. So basically that's as far as that unit can go, which does seem a bit, now that I think of it, it seems like a bit of a lot of hard work when we could come 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 and come down this way. In fact, yes, let's do that. Rather than coming here, let's go this way. So 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. Bearing in mind, of course, they may prevent any movement because of stacking restrictions, because there are 3 combat strengths. This New York unit is in a garrison, so that's like 3 rifles stacked together, so they cannot move just yet, unless they choose to, and that would give a VP essentially to the other side. Okay, so starting here with Arnold, we have the New Hampshire unit, the Hodgson artillery, and the 2nd New Hampshires as well. And I'll move one of those plus Arnold out of the garrison, which is actually the VP hex target for the British, and I'll come along the road here, which negates the other terrain modifiers. And we're okay because they're only a 3 combat strength and leaders stack for free. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, using the strategic movement down the track. Cannot move the 2nd Massachusetts again because of the modifier there. I'm hoping you can see this. It's quite a big map to try and get on my camera. So they can't move. The New York, the 2nd New York unit there can, so we can go 1, 2, 3 and then 4. They can't go any further because you cannot use strategic movement, because it didn't. Oh, actually they did start on the road, so they can use strategic movement. So whereas I went there, you would have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because they are a 4 movement point. The militia here are both sat on top of a powder magazine, and they can move. Now we're going to have to cost more, and we can't use strategic movement because we're not starting on the road. And actually militia have a really bad time of it in combat usually, because they have the modifier to the morale, which is a die roll of -1 straight away. So I might just leave those there where they're safely behind the field works, which is this kind of semicircle on the terrain here. It's essentially defences. Right. We have some potential movement here from the 1st Canadian and the 8th Massachusetts, and then the New Hampshire unit there in the forest could come along and support as well. Let's do that actually. Let's bring them along. So 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay, here we have a problem. That's going to be a 7, so they're going to have to go around. Okay. This is where that stacking is really tricky. Now what I could do, I'll move that one back, is I could move the Massachusetts unit. First I'd have to move the New Hampshires, and then move the Massachusetts unit, and then the 3rd New Hampshires, because you have to sort of have this juggling of where forces go. So let's do that. Let's move this 1st New Hampshires down the track, and then make sure those garrisons are garrisoned at the end of the turn. So we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we're okay to sit with Arnold. The 2nd Massachusetts will have to move, and then the 3rd New Hampshires will come along, park themselves on that garrison. Okay, I think that is movement done, realistically speaking. Cannot move anyone from Gates's wing. There's no combat, no defensive fire, no artillery, and that then is the end of the American turn, meaning we move on to the British, and we slide down the counter to the British side. Reinforcements could could move back another turn if we wanted them to, but I think we'll bring them on now because they've already been delayed somewhat. British reinforcements always come on the B hex, as I mentioned. Slightly off short now, but you'll see what I mean as we go through. Now, because they are so heavily overstacked, they're going to have to be spread out on all the roads as before. In order to do that, though, we first need to move the red units on the river road. So the river road is interesting because it gets to basically a point here where there's a ford, and that cannot be crossed using strategic movement. So basically you hit a natural slowing point for the British. So we're going to move those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that is 8. The leader there can go because they're under their movement limit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And basically we'll just move them all up, with the exception of the artillery that can only go 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. We have a little sort of zigzag chicane there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so as you can see, the British forces are getting quite spread out on that road. The Germans will move now. We have von Riedesel. He's the only German leader. He's also one of the few units that has restrictions in terms of force coordination, because he cannot provide leadership benefits to non-German troops. But apparently he did not speak English at the time, and there were certain issues between the English allowing non-English leaders telling them what to do, basically back in the day. Right. So von Diesel will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, he has a movement of 12, but the rest of his forces do not. The units will come with him again in a nice, neat line. We can stack that one, only has a 1 combat strength. That one we can't. That one we can. This one here, Herb Prinz, if it focuses. There we go, Herb Prinz. That's an optional unit. You have either the Dragoon version of this unit or the Foot Infantry. For simplicity, I've just chosen to use the Foot Infantry for this video. But they're a very strong unit, combat strength of 6. Basically, they're only ever going to be stacked with artillery or a leader. So we have to park them behind the chasseur. And then finally the artillery, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they can sit with the Herb Prinz unit. Okay, that is movement for the River Road area. The militia then, currently making their way through the forest, are going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're going to hit a ravine in a minute, which means they're not going to be able to move quite as quickly. But they will happily get a little bit closer to the Freeman's Farm region, and even across the river fairly quick compared to if they'd been stuck in this traffic jam here. Now for Fraser's units, which is basically these ones, they have a choice. They can come down and up, or we can go round. Tricky to know what to do, because neither is a particularly quick route. And what I might do is I might send the red goats this way and everybody else that way. Partly because the German forces there probably would want to stay with von Riedesel. Maybe. Who knows? But let's do that anyway. So we can move the top ones 4. They're all in good stacking limits. So for speed, I would do it this way. Again, not getting super close. There we go. We're all good with the stacking here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But the artillery have to stop behind. It always throws me slightly when I see this particular artillery unit. It's the Walker artillery. Its combat strength is 5, which is far higher than many of the other artillery units. And I often have a quick look at the combat strengths and think, oh god, they're overstacked, but they're not because it's artillery. Slight aside there. Okay, so final bits of movement for this phase. Again, that stack of German forces. There is an artillery, so go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8, with that intention of meeting up with their compatriots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Artillery is quite slow, and then the militia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They will come with the redcoats. Cool. That is turn 3 done. There is no rifle fire, no rallying, no artillery fire. No one's within range. We've not had combat yet, so no one's within range for any of that stuff. So we're going to jump to turn 4. And turn 4 is the start of the regular movement and the regular activations. Therefore, I will pause this video here. Hopefully it served as a reasonable introduction to the system and to how movement at least works. But we can focus more on the combat and what happens when the sides actually do finally meet in the next video. Hope you'll join me for that one. In the meantime, happy gaming.